Hello. This is Baibars, the Crusaders Nemesis documentary, part 2. We'll do another 16 minutes, and we will call this one. So, let's get into it. Sorry the air's on.
After Turan Shah's death, the Mamluks, along with the Sultanate's leading emirs, met to discuss the succession, and shortly afterwards decided to install Shajar al-Dur as Egypt's female ruler, along with her new husband, the Mamluk commander Izz al-Din Aybak, who became the first Mamluk Sultan of Egypt in July of 1250. Despite this transfer of power, the assassination of the Ayyubid Sultan was met with opposition from his extended family members, particularly the Emir of Aleppo and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, as, after all, the Mamluks were slaves who had overthrown the rightful Sultan of Egypt, and then, in an effort to avoid war, the leading Mamluks, which included the Sultan Aybak, Faris ad-Din Aktai, Bilban al-Rashidi, Qutuz and Baibars, agreed to install the 6-year-old Ayyubid al-Ashraf Musa as a puppet sultan in an effort to appease their enemies. This meant that the Mamluk Aybak was forced to stand down as sultan after little more than a week, to allow the 6-year-old Ayyubid al-Ashraf to replace him. However, this course of action was seen as necessary, as the Mamluks feared that the Ayyubids, who still controlled Syria as well as Palestine, could potentially throw them out of Egypt. Thusly, installing a puppet Ayyubid Sultan, whom they could control, gave them a veneer of legitimacy. Then, despite their efforts of appeasement, the Ayyubid Emir of Syria, An-Nasir Yusuf, who was now the Mamluks' main rival for ultimate power, led an army into Egypt in January of 1251, but was ultimately defeated by the Mamluks under Aybak, and An-Nasir Yusuf, who was now the Mamluks' main rival for ultimate power, led an army into Egypt in January of 1251, but was ultimately defeated by the Mamluks under Aybak, near Al-Saliyah, not far from the Egyptian capital of Cairo, after which al-Ashraf was taken prisoner by Aybak, who had now eliminated his Muslim enemies. After this, Aybak then used Ashraf as a bargaining tool to negotiate a truce with the Syrian Ayyubids, which was mediated by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and resulted in the Mamluks gaining control of Palestine, Gaza, Jerusalem, and the Mediterranean Syrian coast. And feeling that his power was now secure, Aybak then had the young Ayyubid puppet co-sultan Musa thrown into prison, reinstated himself as ruler, and appointed his deputy, Qutuz, as
Who didn't see that coming?
vice sultan in his place in 1252. After this, Aybak moved to consolidate his rule by eliminating any Mamluks he deemed to be a threat to his position, culminating in the assassination of the leading Mamluk emir, Faris ad-Din Aktai, by Qutuz in 1254, marking the beginning of a rift within the Mamluk ranks, which saw Aktai's fellow Mamluks, that included Baibars, being forced to flee to Syria, as they feared assassination themselves, and after this, Aybak dethroned the infant Musa once and for all, and finally declared himself to be the sole Mamluk Sultan of Egypt in 1254. This period in which the Mamluks had seized power over Egypt would ultimately prove to be bloody, as Aybak would face numerous rebellions against his rule over the coming years, one of which sprung up in northern Egypt in 1255, in which Baibars joined the rebels against the Sultan. Despite becoming so powerful, Aybak's rule would end in bizarre circumstances in 1257 when he sought to marry the daughter of the Emir of Mosul in modern-day Iraq, but filled with jealousy over her husband seeking the hand of another woman and also feeling betrayed by him, his wife and former co-ruler, Shajar al-Dur, had Aybak murdered whilst he was taking a bath.
You can't have her as a wife after what she's done and think, yeah, she, like, I'm good. Like, I mean, I'm not saying that she's a terrible person, but there is a thing about trust. And I understand why she did the thing with her husband, you know, keeping the power. I get all that. But she's someone who likes power. But she knows she can't wield it so much because, I hate to say it's a man's world, but back then, definitely. But she doesn't want to part with it.
The Sultan's death meant that Aybak's son, the 15-year-old Mansur Ali, was installed as the new Sultan of Egypt. But, in an act of revenge for the death of his father, Ali had Shajar al-Dur stripped naked and beaten to death with clogs by his handmaidens, before her body was thrown from the city walls into a moat, whilst Aybak's son, al-Mansur Ali, then ruled as Sultan of Egypt from 1257, with Qutuz as his vice-sultan. Whilst the Mamluks were securing their power base in Egypt, word reached the Middle East that a new threat was fast approaching. However, this time, the Muslims would not have to repel another Christian crusade, but instead would have to defend themselves against the most feared horde of invaders the world had ever seen. That being the merciless and seemingly invincible Mongols, who, under the rule of the all-powerful Genghis Khan, as well as his successors, had in the space of 50 years formed a massive empire that encompassed the vast majority of mainland Asia, from the Korean peninsula to the borders of Eastern Europe. Then in 1258, the Mongol hordes entered the Middle East through Iraq and sacked the city of Baghdad, putting some 30,000 Muslims to death in the process, after which the last caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate, al-Mustasim, was wrapped in a rug and trampled to death by the Mongol horses, as they did not want to spill his royal blood. The downfall of the Abbasid Caliphate caused panic throughout the Muslim world, and in response...
Don't take this wrong, but I have to believe that Genghis Khan was a bit of a dick. No offense if you are related to him, which it's like 40 million people today are, but I just gotta believe that's true.
Qutuz assembled the court of the 15-year-old Sultan al-Mansur Ali, where he told the assembled dignitaries that, as the Mongol invasion was such a serious threat, Egypt needed a strong and capable sultan in order to fight them. And thusly, on the 12th of November 1259, Qutuz formally seized power in Egypt by deposing al-Mansur Ali, thusly becoming the third Mamluk Sultan. Until this time, Baibars had been residing in Syria, but after hearing that Qutuz had formally seized power, and perhaps realizing that Syria was too weak to resist the Mongol invaders, he returned to Egypt in 1260, where he was warmly welcomed by Qutuz, who now needed all the experienced commanders he could get. And shortly afterwards, after gifting Baibars a small town within Egypt, the Sultan formally promoted him to become a commander within the Egyptian army. As the Abbasid Caliphate had fallen, the Holy Land was now wide open to attack, and after gathering their forces in order to mount an invasion in 1260, envoys of Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu arrived in Cairo, demanding the surrender of the Egyptian Sultanate by stating, "From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Qutuz, the Mamluk, only those who beg our protection will be safe. We will shatter your mosques, reveal the weakness of your God, and then we will kill your children and old men together. You are the only enemy against whom we have to march." In response to this insult, Qutuz ordered the Mongol envoys to be executed, after which their heads and butchered bodies were hung from Cairo's city walls, thusly making war between the Muslims and the Mongols inevitable. Indeed, the coming conflict would be one of the most important wars in Islamic history, as if the Mamluks failed to stop the invaders, there was every possibility that the Middle East and Islam itself would fall. Although today we know a great deal about the Mongol invasion and its leaders, it is difficult for us to comprehend the effect that their rampaging hordes must have had on the minds of people in their path, as to them, these merciless, murderous warriors that could not be bought off or reasoned with came from another world. And perhaps a fair example would be to liken the Mongols to an alien invasion force that threatened to destroy everything and everyone that resisted them. Then, just as it seemed
Yeah. I mean, Genghis Khan is, he's somebody on that list that I will check out.
Then, just as it seemed the Mongols would descend on the Holy Land in full force, word reached Hulagu that his brother, the supreme Mongol leader, Möngke Khan, had died in the later summer of 1259, and as the threat of civil war now loomed, Hulagu left the region for Mongolia, along with the majority of his invasion force, leaving the weakened Mongols and their vassals under the command of one of his generals, Kitbuka. After the decimation of Baghdad, the Mongols continued their advance to the northwest through Syria, sacking the city of Aleppo in 1260 as they went, and forcing the weak Crusader state of the Principality of Antioch to accept their supremacy and join their armies as vassals, until eventually the invading army came within a matter of miles of the walls of Jerusalem. But when they reached Lower Galilee, north of the Holy City, they halted, as in front of them stood a 20,000-strong Mamluk army, commanded by Qutuz and his right-hand man, Baibars. The following battle, which is known as Ain Jalut, would prove to be one of the most important confrontations in the entire history of the Middle East, as not only did it save the Holy Land, including the Christian kingdoms, from total subjugation, but it also proved that the Mongols were not invincible, and marked the greatest extent of their westward invasion into the Middle East. During the battle, Baibars, who led the Mamluk vanguard, attacked the Mongols head-on, and through a series of feints, eventually lured the invaders towards the main body of the Mamluk army, commanded by Qutuz. Then, after hours of ferocious fighting, in which both sides tried to outflank the other, the Mamluks, who enjoyed greater numbers, eventually gained the upper hand, and after the death of the Mongol commander, Kitbuka, his troops began to rout, leaving over 10,000 of their men dead on the field.
How many times do you think the Mongols got beat or had to retreat like that in their entire time? It probably wasn't a whole lot. And all their conquests, you could probably count on one hand the amount of times in a battle where they lost or ran away. So when it happens, they were probably like, oh man, what did we just run into? But probably made them more mad, so they'd want to come back at them harder and make them pay. Interesting, though.
Although Ain Jalut was not the first time the Mongols had been defeated during their numerous invasions, the battle did prevent them from controlling the Middle East, and as the collapse of their armies in the area, combined with Hulagu returning to Asia, resulted in a power vacuum, the Mamluks were then able to occupy Syria up to the Euphrates River, meaning that, with the exception of the Crusader states that still maintained their foothold along the Mediterranean coast, the Mamluks were now the major power in the Middle East. However, despite securing a great victory over the Mongols that should have solidified his position, Qutuz was not destined to rule over Egypt for much longer, as in October of 1260, whilst the Sultan and his army marched back southwards towards the Egyptian capital of Cairo, Qutuz ordered his army to halt in the desert, as he wanted to practice his hobby of hare coursing, along with his closest commanders, who evidently were far from happy with their master. It is clear that, due to his leadership and service during the Battle of Ain Jalut, Baibars now expected to be given the governorship of the town of Aleppo, but Qutuz, having feared that doing so would make his general too powerful, refused his request, and then after the Mamluk leaders had halted in the desert, Baibars approached Qutuz and asked him for the gift of a captive Mongol slave, which the Sultan agreed to. But after Baibars kissed his master's hand, which may have been a pre-arranged signal, the Mamluks surrounded and attacked the Sultan, with Baibars stabbing him in the neck with his sword, meaning that moments later, Qutuz lay dead on the desert sand, which was stained red with his blood. It is probable that Baibars had arranged to depose Qutuz after the former Sultan refused to grant him the city of Aleppo, but it is also probable that he had been planning to seize the Sultanate for some time before this, as the attack on the Sultan seems to have been well planned and carried out with the other Mamluks backing. But whatever the truth, in the aftermath of the assassination, Baibars, who was now clearly the leader of the Mamluks, moved at speed to consolidate his power base in Egypt, where no one opposed him, resulting in him being officially proclaimed as the 4th Mamluk Sultan of Egypt on the 24th of October 1260. Although the previous Mamluk sultans had arguably proven themselves to be weak or misguided in their decisions, particularly with regard to their closest advisors and relationships, Baibars would, over the coming years, show himself to be a truly gifted and able sultan who would rank alongside the very greatest leaders of the Muslim world, as from the very start of his reign, he began to make intelligent, strategic and political decisions that consolidated his power and would enable him to eventually exert his authority over the entire Middle East. Although the new Sultan's power base in Egypt was secure, the Mamluk Emir of Damascus, Sinjar al-Halabi, still challenged his authority. Thusly, the Sultan moved to unite the Muslim Middle East under his rule by bringing Syria and Damascus under his control, and in January of 1261 defeated the forces of the Emir al-Halabi in the process, granting him control of the majority of Syria. After this, Baibars struck a deal with the Ayyubid Emir of Homs, in which they recognized each other's sovereignty, effectively meaning that the Egyptian Sultan's position was now only threatened by the Mongols. But as the Emir of Homs and Governor of Hama had defeated the Mongols in battle the year before, the Eastern Horde was not an immediate threat, meaning that Baibars could now turn his attention elsewhere to uniting the Muslims against the Christian Crusader states. The first example of Baibars' shrewdness and talent as a leader was his decision in 1261 to reinstate the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate that had been destroyed by the Mongols in Baghdad under his direct rule in Egypt, as having a puppet caliph or religious leader under his control would enable Baibars to shape the entire Islamic Middle East to his own designs, and after finding a suitable candidate in the shape of al-Mustansir, Baibars publicly swore allegiance to him, promising to defend the faith against the enemies of Islam, thusly giving the impression that he was a devout and righteous leader. However, in private, it was the caliph who obeyed Baibars' commands. As his position within the Muslim world was now unchallenged, in the summer of 1261, Baibars staged a mass celebration in the streets of Cairo, in which the Sultan and his puppet Caliph rode together through the streets of the Egyptian capital, after which he was officially proclaimed to be the Sultan of Egypt, as well as the entire Muslim East. And as the threat of another Mongol invasion still loomed in the minds of many Muslims across the region, they willingly accepted the rule of the pale-skinned, blue-eyed former slave, whom they would come to love and fear in equal measure. Now that he ruled the hearts and minds of all Muslims, the new Sultan set about turning Egypt into a state geared for aggressive warfare, with the aim of exerting his control of the entire region and in the process forging an Islamic empire that would last for centuries. As a trainee slave soldier, Baibars had received the strictest and most thorough military training imaginable, in which he and his fellow slaves were forced to practice lethal sword strokes, sometimes up to 1,000 times in a single day, and so it was this total dedication and disciplined training regime that the Sultan now began to incorporate into his armies, that also began to experiment with new ways of fighting and new weaponry, meaning that soon Baibars' armies were amongst the most disciplined and well-trained in the Middle East, if not the world. As well as this, the Sultan...
Not yet.
Sultan began to rebuild his citadels and fortifications across the Middle East and Syria to enable him to withstand any Mongol incursions, and because they had bent the knee to the Mongols before the Ain Jalut campaign, the Sultan now turned his eye to the Christian states, including the Mongol vassal state of the Principality of Antioch, which was now, like all the Christian kingdoms, cut off and surrounded by the Sultan's Muslim empire. Indeed, the coming conflict against the Christians would become one of the most ferocious and bloody in the entire history of the Crusades, as Baibars, along with his new army, would prosecute a war of annihilation against the Christians, in which no quarter was given, as it is clear that the Sultan was determined to, once and for all, expel the Christians from the Middle East and the Holy Land that he deemed to be an Islamic domain.
We're going to go ahead and stop it here. Yep. Can I just say Antioch? What a name. I don't know what it is. I like that. Where are you from? Antioch? Oh. Antioch. What a name. Who came up with that? Oh, it was a guy probably, Pete Ock. He was like, I'm going to name the town after me. And then Pete built a town. Pete Ock built a town. And some people moved in. They were like, this town's awesome, but got to get rid of Pete. They're like, let's kill him. And then we'll call it Anti-Pete. And they were like, nah, Antioch. There you go. That's how the whole thing came about. Right there. I just gave you the history lesson of it. Don't look that up. Just take my word for it. Okay, I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. Pete-Ock. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night.